On a freezing February night in Cest, Louis, a routine tip led Detective Caleb Rivers into an abandoned biomedical plant and straight into the aftermath of a crime that had been hidden for nearly 2 decades. Beneath cracked concrete and rusted steel, he found proof that students had been taken, experimented on, and erased. One woman was still alive. And before she died, she made one thing terrifyingly clear: it wasn't over. The call came in just after 9:40 p.m., the kind of hour when the city settled into a brittle quiet and the river wind carried the smell of rust and cold concrete through downtown Stay. Louis. Detective Caleb Rivers had been finishing paperwork he'd already rewritten twice. His coat still on because the precinct's heating never quite reached his corner office. The tip was thin, anonymous, rushed, almost careless. A man connected to a recent gang shooting had been seen slipping into an abandoned biomedical plant near Ashland Avenue. A place everyone on the force knew but no one bothered with anymore. It had been shuttered since the early 2000s, written off as another dead industrial shell left behind when the city moved on. Caleb almost ignored it, almost. But something in the dispatcher's voice, a pause, a hesitation, made him stand, grab his keys, and head out into the night without waiting for backup. The plant loomed at the edge of an industrial corridor, where streetlights flickered more than they shone, their glow swallowed by chain link fences and graffiti-stained brick. The building itself looked like it was holding its breath. 3 stories of dark windows boarded unevenly, the old corporate logo barely visible beneath years of peeling paint. Caleb parked across the street and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, studying the place like it might study him back. He'd worked homicide long enough to trust instinct, and every instinct told him this wasn't just a hideout. The front gate hung open, bent inward as if something heavy had forced its way through long ago. Snow crunched under his boots as he crossed the lot, hand resting near his holster, breath fogging the beam of his flashlight. Inside, the air was stale and metallic, layered with dust and the faint, sore smell of old chemicals. The lobby had been stripped bare, no furniture, no signage, just scattered papers curling at the edges like dead leaves. He moved room to room with practiced caution, calling out his presence, listening to the echo of his own voice bounce back empty. Offices stood gutted, desks overturned or removed entirely, wires hanging from the ceilings like exposed veins. On the second floor he found what remained of laboratories, rusted examination tables, broken glassware, cabinets still labeled in neat, faded handwriting. It felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate, too deliberate in its abandonment, as if someone had taken care to erase only what they wanted gone. When he found the stairwell leading down, half hidden behind a collapsed shelving unit, he hesitated. The steps were narrow, concrete worn smooth at the center, and colder air drifted upward from below. At the bottom waited a steel door, heavier than the others, its lock smashed recently enough that the metal still shone beneath chipped paint. Caleb pushed it open, and the smell hit him first, antiseptic layered over decay, a contradiction that made his stomach tighten. The basement corridor stretched longer than the building should have allowed, straight and unforgiving, lit only by the beam of his flashlight. Doors lined one side, evenly spaced, each with a narrow reinforced window at eye level. The opposite wall had been sealed with concrete blocks, crude but effective, as if someone had decided there was no longer any need to see what lay beyond. Caleb approached the first door and looked through the glass. A hospital bed sat in the center of the room, sheets yellowed with age, IV tubing draped limply over the rail. On the mattress lay skeletal remains arranged with unsettling care, wrists resting at the sides, head turned slightly as though frozen mid-thought. He didn't open the door right away. He stepped back, drew a slow breath, then forced himself to continue. The second room held the same scene, so did the third and the fourth. Each body was different size, posture, fragments of clothing, but the setup never changed. This wasn't random violence. This was procedure. By the time he reached the final door, his hands were shaking despite years of training and worse scenes than this. He expected another corpse. What he heard instead was breathing, faint, irregular, unmistakably human. Caleb looked through the window and saw movement beneath the blanket, a chest rising and falling with effort. He opened the door and rushed inside, dropping to his knees beside the bed. The woman lying there looked impossibly small, skin stretched thin over bone, hair brittle and uneven against the pillow. Tubes ran from her arm to a nearly empty tee of bag suspended above, its contents clear and minimal. Just enough to keep a body alive but never strong. Her eyes fluttered open when he spoke, unfocused at first, then locking onto his face with something between fear and disbelief. She tried to speak. Only a whisper came out. "Help," she said, the words so soft it felt like it might disappear before it reached him. Caleb called for an ambulance, his voice tight, professional, betraying nothing of the fury building in his chest. As he waited, he scanned the room and saw what made this worse than any crime scene he'd known. The equipment wasn't abandoned, it was maintained. The monitors were old but operational, their screens tracking a heart that refused to stop. Someone had been here recently. Someone had chosen, again and again, to keep this woman alive like this. When the sirens finally echoed above ground and paramedics rushed in, they moved with urgency, swearing under their breath at the sight of the other rooms, at the years implied by the decay. As they wheeled her out, she caught Caleb's sleeve with what little strength she had left. Her eyes searched his face, and for a moment he felt the full weight of what he'd stumbled into. This wasn't a cold case. This was a crime that had never ended. Caleb Rivers stood alone in the basement corridor, after the paramedics rushed the woman upstairs. The echo of their footsteps fading until the building returned to its unnatural silence. The air felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves had absorbed what had just happened, and were holding it in. He forced himself to look again, really look, at what surrounded him. The doors stood open along one side of the hallway, their interiors exposed like wounds that had been hidden too long. Each room mirrored the next with a precision that made his skin crawl, hospital beds bolted to the floor, of poles secured with industrial clamps, monitoring equipment wired into power sources that should not have still been active. Dust lay thick on most surfaces, but not everywhere. Some switches were clean. Some cables showed signs of recent handling. Whoever had done this hadn't simply walked away and forgotten these people. They had been abandoned with intention. He entered the first room slowly, the beam of his flashlight tracing the outline of the body on the bed. The remains were arranged carefully, arms straight, spine aligned, as though death itself had been supervised. There were no restraints visible, but the position told a different story. You didn't need chains when the body no longer had the strength to resist. Caleb crouched beside the bed, noting the of sight still visible on the brittle skin of the arm, the faint discoloration where needles had gone in again and again. The sheets beneath the body were stiff with age, yet tucked with almost professional neatness. Someone had wanted order here. Someone had wanted control. The second room confirmed it wasn't coincidence. This victim had been larger, broader shoulders beneath the decayed clothing, but the setup was identical. The heavy tubing was different, replaced at some point, newer than the bed it fed into. Caleb swallowed hard. This meant the person had outlived the original equipment. This meant maintenance, returns, deliberate care. He stepped back into the corridor and leaned briefly against the cold concrete wall, closing his eyes. In his years as a homicide detective, he'd seen cruelty born of rage, desperation, greed. This was something else. This was patience. This was someone who could wait. By the time he reached the fifth room, the pattern was undeniable. 5 people had been brought down here alive. 5 people had been sustained just long enough for some to be done to them. Something measured, observed, recorded. There were no signs of struggle in most of the rooms. No overturned furniture, no broken restraints. Whatever happened to them had been slow, gradual, a process that wore the body down until resistance became impossible. The horror of it lay not in violence, but in restraint. In the calm, methodical way suffering had been extended. Crime scene units arrived within the hour, flooding the basement with harsh white light that stripped away what little mystery remained and replaced it with brutal clarity. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, every inch cataloged. The medical examiner on site moved from room to room, her expression tightening with each new discovery. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her words were precise and grim. These remains weren't recent. 15 years, maybe more. The environmental conditions, the level of decay, the equipment all pointed to a long, abandoned operation that had somehow never truly shut down. When she examined the IV lines more closely, she confirmed what Caleb already feared. These people hadn't been left to die. They had been kept alive until their bodies failed. Upstairs, the building buzzed with controlled chaos. Officers secured entrances, neighbors were questioned, and the shooting suspect that had brought Kayla here in the first place was quickly forgotten. This discovery eclipsed everything. It wasn't just a crime scene, it was a graveyard disguised as a laboratory. As the night stretched toward morning, the implications settled in. Missing persons cases that had gone cold years ago, faces that had faded from bulletin boards and databases, might all trace back to this single place. Caleb watched as the bodies were carefully removed, one by one, draped and carried past him with a reverence that felt long overdue. Each one represented a family that had waited, hoped, been told to move on. When dawn finally crept through the cracked windows, Caleb stood outside the building, the cold biting through his coat. He made calls he'd never wanted to make, briefings that would ripple through the department and beyond. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a system, a process. Someone had designed this, funded it, protected it. And someone had made sure it stayed hidden long after the doors above were locked, and the company name faded from public memory. The woman pulled from the final room was no exception, she was the anomaly. The proof that whatever had happened here hadn't truly ended. Back inside, Caleb returned once more to the basement before it was sealed off. He stood in the corridor, now stripped bare, the doors removed, the beds gone, the rooms reduced to empty concrete boxes. Without the equipment, without the bodies, the space looked smaller, almost ordinary. That frightened him more than anything else. It meant this kind of place could exist anywhere, unnoticed, dismissed as another forgotten building. He thought of the woman's eyes. The way they had locked onto his, as if he were the last solid thing in a world that had dissolved around her. She had survived when the others hadn't. Not because someone wanted her saved, but because someone wanted to see how long she could last. As he walked back up the stairs, Caleb understood that what he'd found wasn't the end of a mystery, but the beginning of something far larger and far darker. 5 rooms, 5 dead, 1 survivor barely clinging to life. That ratio felt deliberate, calculated. Whatever experiment had been conducted here, it had produced results someone cared deeply about. And somewhere beyond this building, beyond this city, the person responsible was still breathing, still free, still capable of doing it again. The thought followed him out into the pale morning light, settling in his chest with the certainty that this case would not let him go. She was still alive, and that single fact bent reality in a way Caleb Rivers was not prepared for. After years of working homicide, death had become something he could categorize, process, and file away in the locked compartments of his mind. Survival in a place like this was different. It demanded attention. It demanded responsibility. As the paramedics rushed her through the narrow corridor and up the stairs, Caleb followed until protocol forced him to stop, watching as her frail body disappeared into the ambulance under harsh fluorescent light. The doors slammed shut, sirens ignited the night, and then she was gone, carried back into a world that had moved on without her. The basement fell silent again, but it no longer felt empty. It felt unfinished. At the hospital, Caleb stood just outside the trauma bay, hands shoved into his coat pockets, listening to the muffled urgency behind the doors. Machines beeped, voices overlapped, orders were given and repeated. A nurse brushed past him, her expression unreadable, practiced neutrality masking whatever thoughts flickered beneath. When the attending physician finally stepped out, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. The woman's condition was critical. Extreme malnutrition, muscle atrophy, organ failure hovering at the edge. Her body had been kept alive on the bare minimum, sustained just enough to prevent death, never enough to heal. The doctor said he'd never seen anything like it outside of war zones or long-term hostage situations. Even then, this was worse. This was intentional. Caleb was allowed a few minutes at her bedside. The room was dim, lights lowered to ease the strain on eyes that had known darkness far, far too long. Tubes and wires surrounded her, replacing the crude setup she'd been pulled from with something cleaner, gentler, but no less overwhelming. Her chest rose and fell with mechanical assistance, each breath a negotiation. When he spoke her name, one they had coaxed from her barely conscious mind, her eyelids fluttered. There was recognition there, faint but undeniable. She knew he was the one who had found her. She knew he was real. He leaned closer, keeping his voice low, steady. He told her she was safe now, that she was in a hospital, that no one was going to hurt her anymore. The words felt fragile in his mouth, promises he wasn't sure the world would let him keep. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak. The sound that came out was thin, scraped raw by years of disuse. She told him time didn't work the way it used to. Days blurred. Seasons vanished. The only markers were the moments when someone came to change the EV, to check the machines, to write something down and leave again. She never saw his face clearly. He never spoke unless necessary. She learned to measure life by pain and hunger, by how much her body could endure before slipping away again. When he asked how long she'd been there, she shook her head slowly. Too long, longer than she could remember. When he asked why she thought she was still alive, her eyes shifted toward the machines, toward the bags of fluid dripping into her veins. He wanted to see, she whispered. See what? She swallowed, throat working painfully. How long? The monitors spiked briefly, alarms chirping before settling back into their grim rhythm. The doctor stepped closer, signaling they were pushing her too hard. But Caleb had one question left burning in his chest. She answered it without being asked. His name or something close to it, a doctor, a scientist. A man who believed what he was doing mattered more than who he did it to. She said he wasn't finished. That there were others. Other places. The effort it took to say that seemed to drain what little strength she had left. Her eyes closed, her grip on Caleb's fingers loosening until it slipped away entirely. The medical team moved in, efficient, urgent, shutting him out as they fought to stabilize a body that had been surviving on borrowed time for nearly 2 decades. She died just before dawn. The doctor told him gently, as if softness could soften the weight of it. Her heart had simply given up. It wasn't a failure of treatment, it was inevitability catching up. Caleb stood by the window of the waiting area, watching the city wake up, cars moving, people heading to work, unaware that a woman who had vanished from the world had just brushed against it one last time. She had survived longer than anyone should have, not because she was meant to, but because someone had needed her to. Later, when the paperwork was done and the body moved, Caleb sat alone in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel without realizing it. The image of her face lingered behind his eyes, not as she had been found, but as she might have been before, young, hopeful, convinced that signing a form or trusting a promise was a way forward. Survival, he realized, had not been a victory for her. It had been another form of imprisonment. She had endured not to live, but to be observed, measured, reduced to data. Back at the precinct, the case took on a different gravity. This was no longer about unidentified remains or long, forgotten missing persons. There was now a voice attached to the crime, however briefly it had been heard. Her words echoed in every meeting, every report, every quiet moment between calls. Someone was still out there. Someone had built a system capable of hiding this for years. Someone had walked away from that basement knowing at least one person was still breathing below ground. That knowledge changed Caleb. It sharpened his focus, stripped away any lingering distance he might have kept between himself and the work. He replayed her final moments again and again, not out of morbid fixation, but because he understood what she had given him. Not just a name, not just a warning, but proof that this wasn't history. It was ongoing. The dead rooms beneath the abandoned building were not relics, as they were chapters. And somewhere, The next chapter was already being written. That night, long after the city had settled again, Caleb returned to the edge of the industrial district and parked across from the building. It stood exactly as it had before, dark and quiet, betraying nothing. He watched it for a long time, thinking about the woman who had survived 18 years in silence, just to die hours after being found. Her survival had not been a miracle. It had been evidence. And now that evidence belongs to him. The words she left behind did not arrive all at once. They came fractured, torn from her with effort, as though each syllable had to fight its way past years of enforced silence. Caleb Rivers replayed them in his mind long after the monitors had gone quiet and the hospital room had emptied. She hadn't spoken in sentences, not really. What she gave him were fragments, warnings more than statements, but they carried a weight that pressed down on everything that followed. He's still out there. He hasn't stopped. There are others. Those phrases clung to him like a second skin, reshaping the case from something monstrous yet contained into something vast and unfinished. In the hours after her death, Caleb sat at his desk staring at a blank report, unable to begin. Procedures demanded clarity, timeline, location, victim status. But how did you document a life that had been stretched thin over 18 stolen years? How did you capture the meaning of last words that weren't a confession or a name, but a door opening into deeper darkness? He finally began to write, careful and precise, noting her condition, her statements, the implications without speculation. Still, even as he typed, he knew the truth lived between the lines. She hadn't been warning him about the past. She had been warning him about the present. By mid-morning, the department was buzzing. Supervisors moved in and out of conference rooms, phones ringing nonstop as missing persons detectives, cold case units, and federal liaisons were pulled into the orbit of the discovery. Caleb briefed them once, then again, repeating the same details until his voice felt hollow. 5 deceased, 1 survivor, 18 years underground. Each retelling made the reality more solid and more unbelievable at the same time. When he reached the part about her final words, the room always went quiet. No one interrupted. No one asked him to clarify. They understood what it meant without needing it spelled out. If she was telling the truth and there was no reason to believe otherwise, then the person responsible hadn't vanished with the abandoned building. They had simply relocated. That possibility reframed everything. The basement on Ashland Avenue was no longer an endpoint, that it was a prototype. The equipment found there was outdated, inefficient by modern standards, yet meticulously used. Someone who went to that trouble would not simply stop. Caleb began to see the space not as a tome, but as an early chapter in a long, evolving project. The survivor's endurance had not been an accident or an act of mercy. It had been a data point. She had lived because her body could still provide information, because someone had decided she was useful alive, and would be more valuable that way. As the autopsy results on the recovered bodies came in, the pattern grew clearer. Each victim had shown signs of prolonged exposure to experimental compounds, substances that had no legitimate approval records. Their deaths varied: cardiac failure, internal bleeding, neurological collapse, but the underlying cause was the same. Their bodies had been pushed beyond their limits in controlled increments. Caleb couldn't escape the image of someone watching this happen, recording it, adjusting variables, treating human lives like lines on a chart. When he matched those findings with the survivor's description of a man who came and went without emotion, who spoke rarely and never explained himself, the shape of the antagonist began to form. Not impulsive, not reckless. Someone methodical, disciplined, and frighteningly patient. Late that night, Caleb returned to the hospital to speak with the attending physician one last time. He needed to hear it from someone else, to confirm that he wasn't reading too much into a dying woman's words. The doctor didn't hesitate. In his professional opinion, the survivor had been kept alive deliberately. Her nutritional intake had been calibrated to the minimum required to maintain organ function. Infections had been treated just enough to prevent death, never enough to restore strength. This wasn't neglect, it was management. When Caleb asked how long a person could survive under such conditions, the doctor shook his head slowly. There was no established answer. No ethical study would ever allow it. What that woman had endured had expanded the boundaries of what was known. Not because it should have been known, but because someone had forced it to be. Driving home afterward, Caleb realized the survivor's final message had done something else, something quieter, but just as profound. It had denied him the comfort of resolution. There was no closure to be found in identifying the dead alone. No satisfaction in sealing off the basement and filing it away. Her words insisted on continuation. They demanded pursuit. She had not lived through 18 years of captivity only to become a footnote. She had spoken because she needed someone to know that the danger was ongoing, that saving her had not stopped the harm. It had merely exposed it. Over the following days, Caleb began to retrace her life before the basement, searching for the point where the world had let her slip through its fingers. He reviewed missing persons reports from the late 90s, noticing patterns others had missed or dismissed. Young adults, students, financially vulnerable, their disappearances spaced just far enough apart to avoid drawing concentrated attention. When he overlaid those dates with records of defunct research companies and failed clinical trials, the coincidences multiplied. It was as if someone had learned, adapted, refined their approach over time. The survivor's warning echoed again other places. That meant infrastructure, planning, protection. What unsettled Caleb most was the restraint evident in the crime. The person responsible had not sought publicity or recognition. There were no manifestos, no messages left behind. Everything had been designed to remain invisible, to blend into bureaucratic gaps and societal assumptions. When students vanished, they were labeled runaways or dropouts. When a company folded, it was chalked up to market failure. The system itself had done much of the hiding. The survivor had known this. That was why her last effort had been spent making sure someone listened. At night, sleep came in fragments. Caleb dreamed of hallways that never ended, of doors opening onto empty rooms, of machines humming softly in the dark. Each time he woke, the same thought greeted him: she had survived because she was meant to be observed, not rescued. That realization hardened into resolve. He owed her more than a report, more than a name on a case file. He owed her belief. Belief that what she said mattered. Belief that the truth was still moving somewhere ahead of him, not buried behind sealed concrete. By the end of the week, Caleb no longer referred to the case as a discovery. In his mind, it had become an interruption. A moment where something hidden had surfaced briefly before slipping away again. The survivor's final words were not an ending or even a warning in the traditional sense. They were a handoff. She had carried the knowledge of what was happening for 18 years in silence. And in her last moments, she passed it to him. What he chose to do with it would determine whether her survival had meaning or whether it had been just another cruel extension of the experiment. The deeper Caleb Rivers dug into the identities of the dead, the more disturbing the pattern became. At first glance, the victims appeared unconnected beyond the obvious fact that they had all ended up beneath the same abandoned building. But once names replace case numbers and lives emerged from the blur of forensic reports, a quiet symmetry revealed itself. Each of them had been young, barely past adolescence, standing at the edge of adulthood with plans still forming and futures not yet burdened by compromise. They had disappeared within a narrow window of time, close enough together to suggest coordination, yet spaced just far enough apart to avoid setting off alarms. Individually, their vanishings could be explained away. Together, they told a story no one had wanted to read. Caleb spread the files across the conference table late one evening, the precinct nearly empty, the hum of fluorescent lights his only company. He read through old missing persons reports written in different hands, some detailed, others heartbreakingly thin. There were photographs clipped to yellowing paper, graduation smiles, badges, snapshots taken by friends who assumed there would always be more time. The language in the reports followed a familiar pattern: adult. No sign of forced entry, possibly left voluntarily. Investigation suspended pending new information. Each conclusion felt like a quiet surrender, a bureaucratic way of saying the world had moved on without them. What struck him most was where they had come from. Every victim had been enrolled at a university within the same region, institutions that served predominantly black and minority students, schools with limited resources but deep-rooted communities. These were places where ambition burned bright against systemic odds, where students worked multiple jobs just to stay enrolled. Financial stress appeared again and again in the background notes of the reports, mentioned almost casually, as if it were a character flaw rather than a vulnerability. Caleb felt a familiar anger rise. Desperation had not just been a shared circumstance. It had been the selection criteria. As he traced their last known movements, a common thread tightened. Each student had attended an off-campus appointment shortly before disappearing. Each had mentioned to someone, a roommate, a parent, a friend, that they had signed up for a paid research opportunity. The sums varied, but the promise was the same: fast money, no long-term commitment, a way to solve an immediate problem. Tuition, rent, medical bills. For students already accustomed to sacrificing sleep and security to stay afloat, the offer would have sounded like relief. Caleb imagined the conversations they must have had, the calculations made in cramped dorm rooms and shared apartments. 6 weeks. A few visits. Just long enough to breathe again. The university's records offered little help. The programs had been marketed as legitimate, their materials professionally printed, their consent forms dense with language few non-specialists would fully grasp. Oversight had been minimal, responsibility diffused across departments that assumed someone else had done the vetting. When students stopped showing up to class, professors marked them absent, then dropped them from rosters. Advisors sent emails that went unanswered. Eventually files were closed. Life went on. The system had not failed loudly. It had failed quietly, efficiently, exactly as it was designed to. Caleb began contacting families, starting with the oldest cases. The calls were some of the hardest he'd ever made. Years had passed. Wounds had scarred over without healing. But the sound of a detective's voice still carried hope, whether the families wanted it or not. Many had been told, explicitly or implicitly, to accept that their children had chosen to leave. Some had been advised to stop asking questions. Others had kept searching on their own, stapling flyers to telephone poles, calling hospitals and shelters, refusing to let their children dissolve into statistics. When Caleb told them their loved ones had been found, the reactions varied: relief, devastation, anger, but beneath it all was the same realization. They had been right not to let go. In listening to their stories, Caleb heard the same details repeated with slight variations. A phone call that never came. A promise to be home by evening. A plan to drop out temporarily and return with money in hand. One mother described how her son had sounded excited, nervous but hopeful, like someone standing at the edge of a door he believed would open to something better. Another parent admitted they'd encouraged their daughter to take the opportunity, trusting that anything connected to a medical study had to be safe. That trust, Caleb realized, had been weaponized. As the list of names grew, so did the implications. These were not random victims chosen in moments of opportunity. They had been identified, tracked, evaluated. Someone had studied their lives closely enough to know who would be missed the least, whose disappearance could be absorbed by institutional indifference. The cruelty of it was not just in what had been done to them physically, but in how their social invisibility had been exploited. Their lives had been weighed and found expendable long before they were ever taken. Caleb compiled timelines, layering them over one another until patterns emerged. Recruitment cycles aligned with academic calendars. Disappearances clustered around midterms and finals, when stress peaked and students were most vulnerable. The more he looked, the clearer it became that the perpetrator understood not just medicine, but people. He knew where pressure points existed and how to apply them without leaving obvious marks. He understood the gaps in oversight, the assumptions made about young adults from marginalized backgrounds. He had designed his operation to fit neatly into those gaps. The survivor's story took on new meaning in this context. She had not been an exception chosen at random. She had been part of the same system, selected for the same reasons. Her prolonged survival suggested something else, something unsettling. Perhaps her body had reacted differently. Perhaps she had become useful in a way the others had not. Caleb found himself wondering how many had died quickly and how many had lingered, kept alive just long enough to provide answers no ethical researcher would ever seek. As days passed, the case file grew thicker, heavier until it felt less like documentation and more like a ledger of debts long overdue. Caleb understood now that the discovery beneath the abandoned building was only the most visible layer of harm. The deeper wound lay in the years of silence that followed each disappearance. The collective shrug that allowed a predator to operate without interference. This was not just about a single killer or a single company. It was about a structure that allowed certain lives to be quietly removed without consequence. Late one night, after the precinct had emptied again, Caleb gathered the photographs and arranged them in a row along the table. He studied their faces, forcing himself to sit with the discomfort rather than rush past it. These were not just victims. They were students, children, friends, people who had trusted a system that had offered them opportunity and delivered annihilation instead. The realization settled into him with grim clarity. The pattern he was uncovering was not merely evidence of a crime. It was proof of intent. And intent, once established, demanded a response that went far beyond solving a case. The name surfaced quietly, buried in outdated records and corporate filings that hadn't been touched in years. Northvale Biomedical did not appear in any recent database. And at first glance it looked like nothing more than another failed startup, swallowed by the long graveyard of American biotech ventures. Caleb Rivers found it while cross-referencing property ownership with old business licenses tied to the abandoned building. The company had dissolved legally more than a decade earlier, its assets liquidated, its offices vacated, its digital footprint scrubbed down to a handful of archived web pages and yellowed paperwork. On paper it was dead. In practice it felt disturbingly alive. Northvale's public history was unremarkable, almost boring. Founded in the early 90s, it branded itself as a small research firm focused on neurological treatments and mood stabilization therapies. The language in its promotional materials was carefully chosen, heavy on phrases like innovation, breakthrough potential, and patient-centered research. Caleb recognized the tone immediately. It was the kind of language designed to reassure investors and disarm scrutiny. Vague enough to promise progress without committing to anything concrete. There was no obvious scandal attached to the company's collapse, no lawsuits that had made headlines, no whistleblowers who had stepped forward. It had simply run out of money, according to the official story, and closed its doors. That explanation unraveled the moment Caleb compared Northvale's timeline to the disappearance of the victims. The years lined up too cleanly. The company had been most active during the exact period when students began vanishing. Its financial decline coincided with the end of those disappearances at the Ashland Avenue site. And yet, the survivor's final warning suggested the work had not stopped. That contradiction gnawed at him. Companies failed all the time. Operations ended. But people with obsessions did not simply quit when funding dried up. They adapted. Caleb requested everything the city still had on Northvale: permits, inspection reports, correspondence with regulatory agencies. Most of it was incomplete. Files were missing. Oversight had been minimal, in part because Northvale had positioned itself as a preclinical research firm rather than an active trial operator. That distinction had allowed it to operate in a gray area, conducting preparatory studies that did not technically require the same level of scrutiny as human trials. It was a loophole, and someone had driven straight through it. What chilled Caleb was not that the loophole existed, but how perfectly it had been used. Digging deeper, he found records of trial applications that had been submitted and denied. The stated reasons were always the same: insufficient safety data, unclear methodology, lack of oversight. Northvale had been told no more than once. In most cases, that would have been the end of it. A legitimate company would have revised its approach or pivoted to a different line of work. Northvale had done something else entirely. It had gone quiet. No more applications, no more correspondence, just silence. And in that silence, the disappearances had continued. Caleb began to understand the brilliance of it, in the most damning sense of the word. By abandoning the formal approval process, Northvale had freed itself from accountability. There were no inspectors to satisfy, no reports to file, no external eyes watching what happened behind closed doors. The company name had become a shell, a front that could be discarded when convenient. The building beneath which the victims were found had once housed Northvale's legitimate operations. That connection alone explained how the equipment had ended up there. What it did not explain was how the operation had persisted long after the company's official death. When Caleb interviewed former employees, most claimed ignorance. Some genuinely seemed shocked. Others were defensive, eager to distance themselves from a past they insisted had been ordinary. They spoke of short contracts, vague research goals, and sudden layoffs. One former lab technician admitted that things had felt rushed toward the end, that safety protocols had been bypassed, but insisted she'd left before anything illegal occurred. Caleb believed her, mostly. The structure of the operation suggested compartmentalization. People had been allowed to see only what they needed to see. The real work had likely been conducted by a single mind, or a very small group, insulated from exposure. The money trail told a more unsettling story. Even after Northvale declared bankruptcy, certain accounts continued to move funds. Small amounts, carefully spaced, rotted through shell companies with no obvious purpose. These were not the desperate transactions of a failing business. They were deliberate, controlled. Someone had planned for this, had ensured resources would remain available, even after the public entity collapsed. Caleb realized then that Northvale Biomedical had never been the true operation. It had been a phase, a test run. When it became inconvenient, it had been shed like a skin. The survivor's words echoed again in his mind. Other places, that plural mattered. Northvale had been one location, one iteration. Its failure had not ended the experiment. It had refined it. Whoever stood behind it had learned what worked, and what drew attention. The basement beneath Ashland Avenue was a crude solution by later standards. But it had been effective. It had stayed hidden for years. That success would not have gone unnoticed by the person who orchestrated it. What disturbed Caleb most was how easily the company had slipped through the cracks of memory. Even within the department, few people recognized the name. To most, it was just another forgotten business in a city littered with them. That anonymity had been a shield. It meant no one had thought to connect missing students to a defunct biotech firm. It meant families had been left chasing shadows, while the truth sat quietly in archived files. The system had not just failed to stop the crime. It had failed to remember it. Late one evening, Caleb stood outside the abandoned building again, this time with the company's name fresh in his mind. Northvale Biomedical. The words sounded harmless, even respectable. He imagined them printed on brochures, spoken at recruitment tables, trusted without question. He imagined students signing forms beneath that name, believing they were stepping into something legitimate. That trust had been essential. Without it, the operation would have collapsed immediately. The cruelty of the scheme lay not only in what was done, but in how deeply it relied on belief. By the time Caleb left the site, the conclusion was unavoidable. Northvale was not the villain of the story. It was the mask. The real threat was the individual or individuals who had created it, used it, and discarded it once it had served its purpose. The company's collapse had not been an end. It had been a transition. And if the survivor was right, then whatever had come next was likely even harder to see, even better hidden, and still very much in motion. The man behind Northvale Biomedical did not appear in headlines, biographies, or professional accolades. Caleb Rivers found him the way you find people who don't want to be found through absence. Drawer. Adrian Kovacs surfaced only in fragments, a signature on early patent applications, a name on a defunct faculty directory, a few immigration records stamped decades earlier. He was a specialist without a specialty, a researcher whose work never quite crossed into public recognition. Born in Eastern Europe during the last years of the Cold War, Kovacs had arrived in the United States with credentials that were just impressive enough to open doors and just vague enough to avoid scrutiny. By the time anyone thought to look closely, he had already learned how to disappear in plain sight. Caleb studied the man's academic history late into the night, tracing a path that zigzagged between institutions without ever settling. Kovacs had earned degrees in biochemistry and neuropharmacology. His early work focused on mood regulation and stress response. On paper, his interests aligned with legitimate therapeutic goals. Depression, anxiety, trauma fields desperate for breakthroughs and often tolerant of aggressive experimentation. Yet his publication record told another story. His papers were sparse, cautious to the point of opacity, heavy on theory and light on results. It was as if he were deliberately withholding something, testing ideas privately rather than subjecting them to peer review. To most colleagues, that made him unremarkable. To Caleb, it made him suspicious. When Northvale Biomedical was founded, Kovacs positioned himself not as a visionary, but as a facilitator. He let investors believe the company was a collaborative effort, a team-driven enterprise. His name appeared on documents, but rarely at the forefront. He hired administrators to handle public-facing operations, scientists to run surface-level research, and consultants to manage compliance. This structure allowed him to remain insulated, a shadow behind the machinery. If questions arose, they were answered by layers of bureaucracy before they ever reached him. And when those questions became too pointed, the company folded quietly, leaving Kovacs untouched. What unsettled Caleb most was how clean Kovacs's disappearance had been. After Northvale declared bankruptcy, there were no records of lawsuits, no attempts by former employees to reclaim unpaid wages, no visible fallout. It was as if everyone involved had simply agreed to forget the man existed. That kind of collective amnesia did not happen by accident. It suggested fear or complicity or a combination of both. Caleb began to suspect that Kovacs had cultivated an environment where no one knew enough to feel safe speaking out, and those who did knew better than to try. The few former colleagues who remembered him described the same traits: quiet, polite, intensely focused. He spoke with a soft accent that made people lean in, lowering their own voices without realizing it. He asked questions that seemed harmless until you thought about them later. How long can the human nervous system adapt before it breaks? What does prolonged deprivation reveal about metabolic thresholds? These were framed as academic curiosities, but in retrospect, they sounded like blueprints. One former associate admitted that Kovacs had an unsettling habit of discussing failure with fascination rather than concern. When experiments didn't work, he wasn't frustrated. He was curious. Caleb eventually found evidence that Kovacs's ambitions had been checked more than once. Regulatory boards had rejected his proposals, citing ethical ambiguities and insufficient safeguards. Rather than fighting those decisions publicly, Kovacs had withdrawn, retreating into private research under the cover of Northvale's infrastructure. That retreat was telling. It meant he understood the boundaries of acceptable science, and had chosen to cross them deliberately. He wasn't ignorant of ethics. He simply didn't value them. To him, regulations were obstacles, not protections. Human consent was a technicality, something that could be engineered through desperation and paperwork. The survivor's account fit this profile too well. A man who visited rarely, spoke little, and observed constantly. A man who adjusted variables without emotion. Kovacs had not needed to explain himself to his subjects. Explanation implied recognition of their humanity. Observation required none. Caleb imagined him standing in the basement, clipboard in hand, watching monitors flicker as bodies weakened. Not angry, not excited, just attentive. The kind of attention reserved for machines. Financial records painted the final piece of the portrait. Kovacs had never relied solely on institutional funding. Even before Northvale's collapse, he had moved money through offshore accounts, diversifying income streams in ways that suggested long-term planning. This was not the behavior of a man chasing one breakthrough. before fading into obscurity. It was the behavior of someone building sustainability for an operation he expected to last decades. When Northvale failed, he did not scramble. He transitioned. The company had been a shell, and he had simply stepped out of it. Caleb began to see Kovacs not as a rogue scientist, but as something more dangerous. He was an architect. He designed systems that allowed harm to continue without drawing attention. He exploited institutional blind spots, financial loopholes, and social indifference with equal precision. He understood that the easiest way to hide a crime was to make it look like nothing unusual had happened. Students disappeared all the time. Companies failed all the time. People moved on. What made Kovacs truly frightening was his patience. He had no need for urgency. His work was incremental, his goals long-term. The survivors' 18 years underground were not a tragedy to him, they were an achievement. Proof that the human body could be pushed further than anyone had documented before. Proof that suffering could be extended, measured, refined. Caleb felt a surge of anger at that realization, but beneath it lay something colder. Respect, twisted and unwanted, for the sheer discipline it must have taken to maintain such an operation without slipping. By the time Caleb finished assembling the profile, one conclusion was unavoidable. Adrian Kovacs was not finished. Men like him did not stop because of exposure or failure. They adapted. They changed locations, names, methods. The survivor's warning echoed again, sharper now. Other places. That meant Kovacs was still experimenting, still watching, still collecting data from lives no one else was paying attention to. And as long as he remained a ghost in the system, he could continue doing exactly what he believed he was meant to do. Caleb closed the file and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For the first time since the basement discovery, he felt a shift in the case. This was no longer about uncovering what had happened. It was about anticipating what would happen next. Kovacs was not a relic of a forgotten crime. He was an active variable. And somewhere, in a room designed to look unremarkable, he was likely already observing his next subject. Convinced that history would eventually justify him. The first real cracks in the story came not from databases or financial records, but from living rooms filled with framed photographs and silence that had grown heavy over time. Caleb Rivers learned quickly that families remembered details no report ever captured. They remembered tone, hesitation, the way a voice sounded when someone was trying to convince themselves as much as anyone else. When he began reaching out to relatives of the victims, he expected grief. What he did not expect was how many of them had been carrying the same unanswered question for years, waiting for someone to finally ask it out loud. The mother of one victim invited him into a small apartment on the north side of the city, a place that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old books. She had kept her son's room exactly as it was the day he left, as if freezing the space might keep time from moving forward. When Caleb explained why he was there, she nodded slowly, as though part of her had always known this moment would come. She didn't cry at first. Instead, she sat down and told him about the last conversation they'd had. Her son had sounded relieved, hopeful. He had talked about a research program, something temporary, something that would help him get through the semester without dropping out. It's safe, he'd said. It's through a medical company. They wouldn't be allowed to do it otherwise. That sentence echoed through nearly every interview that followed. Different families, different voices, same reassurance. The victims had framed the opportunity not as a risk, but as a solution. Tuition deadlines loomed. Financial aid had fallen through. Jobs weren't enough. The study promised fast money and legitimacy, wrapped in the language of science and progress. For students accustomed to navigating systems stacked against them, it sounded like a rare door opening instead of another one slamming shut. Caleb listened as parents described encouraging their children to take the offer, believing it was better than watching them drown under debt. One father admitted that he'd driven his daughter to her first appointment himself. He remembered the building, clean and professional, the receptionist who smiled and offered coffee. Nothing about it had seemed dangerous. When his daughter didn't come home that night, He told himself she must have stayed late, must have decided to crash with a friend. By the time he realized something was wrong, the trail had already gone cold. He had blamed himself for years, convinced that his trust had been the final mistake. When Caleb told him what they had found beneath the abandoned facility, the man closed his eyes and whispered, "So it was real." All of it. As these stories accumulated, a clearer picture emerged. The victims hadn't been taken by force off the street. They had walked willingly into the beginning of their captivity, guided by paperwork, signatures, and the promise of help. The cruelty of it lay in how ordinary it all sounded. There were consent forms, orientation sessions, contact numbers that stopped working after a while. Everything looked legitimate until it wasn't. Caleb began to see how easily the operation could have continued unchecked. It didn't require secrecy at first. It relied on trust. Several families remembered flyers posted near student centers and bus stops, printed on high-quality paper with reassuring language and official-looking logos. Others recalled emails sent through university mailing lists, careful to avoid specific claims while emphasizing compensation and confidentiality. The programs were always described as limited-time opportunities, encouraging quick decisions before spots filled up. Caleb realized this urgency was not accidental. It left little room for second thoughts, little time for questions that might lead to scrutiny. The pressure students felt in their personal lives had been mirrored and amplified by the recruitment itself. One mother handed Caleb a box she had kept under her bed for nearly 20 years. Inside were copies of emails, pamphlets, even a partially filled intake form her daughter had brought home to show her. At the bottom of one page was a company name Caleb recognized immediately: Northvale Biomedical. Seeing it printed there, mundane and official, sent a chill through him. This was no rumor or assumption. It was confirmation that the family's memories aligned with the evidence he had been building. Northvale had not just existed in records. It had inserted itself directly into these lives. As Caleb compared notes across interviews, another pattern took shape. The victims had all been struggling, but not visibly failing. They were not dropouts or runaways. They were students on the edge, doing everything they could to stay afloat. That made their disappearances easier to misinterpret. When they stopped showing up, the assumption wasn't foul play. It was burnout, a quiet exit. The system accepted that narrative readily. Caleb felt a familiar bitterness settle in. If these students had come from wealth or influence, if their names carried weight, the response would have been different. Instead, their absence had been absorbed without resistance. Listening to the families forced Caleb to confront something uncomfortable about his own profession. Many of them described the same initial police response: polite concern that faded quickly. Suggestions that their children might have chosen to leave, reminders that adults were allowed to disappear. The implication was always the same: stop looking, move on. Those words had echoed for years, leaving parents trapped between grief and guilt. Now, sitting across from Caleb, they watched him closely, as if waiting to see whether this time would be different. What struck him most was that none of the family spoke about revenge. They spoke about truth. About wanting to know what had happened so they could finally grieve without doubt. One woman said she didn't care who went to prison as long as she'd stop imagining her daughter suffering alone somewhere. Caleb didn't tell her that her daughter hadn't been alone, that others had suffered beside her in silence. He wasn't sure whether that knowledge would comfort or destroy her. By the time he finished the last interview of the week, Caleb was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. The weight of shared trust and shared betrayal pressed down on him. The families had given him more than information. They had given him responsibility. Their stories confirmed that the operation had not been hidden in shadows from the start. It had operated in plain sight, shielded by the credibility of science and the desperation of those it targeted. Driving back to the precinct, Caleb understood that the investigation had crossed a line. It was no longer just about identifying a killer or uncovering an illegal experiment. It was about confronting how easily exploitation could be dressed up as opportunity, how willingly society accepted the disappearance of those it deemed replaceable. The families had seen the warning signs too late. Now, through their voices, Caleb saw them clearly. And he knew that uncovering the truth would mean challenging not just one man or one company, but the quiet assumptions that had allowed the crime to endure for so long. The name did not stand out at first. It appeared in a footnote of an old university memo, buried beneath scheduling notices and policy updates that no one had looked at in years. Evelyn Moore, Associate Administrator, Student Support Liaison, titles that suggested guidance and advocacy protection. Caleb Rivers almost skimmed past it, but something about the timing made him stop. Moore's tenure overlapped perfectly with the first wave of disappearances. Not just at one institution, but across several. That coincidence was too clean to ignore. Caleb began reconstructing her career the way one might trace a faint scent through a crowded room. Moore had moved laterally through the academic system, never staying in one place too long, always stepping into roles that gave her access to student records without placing her under public scrutiny. She worked in student affairs, financial counseling, retention services, positions designed to identify at-risk students, those struggling quietly with tuition gaps, housing insecurity, family obligations. On paper, she existed to help them. In practice, she had been perfectly positioned to identify who would say yes to the right offer. Former colleagues described her as efficient, deeply organized, and relentlessly professional. She remembered names, followed up on emails, checked in at exactly the right moment. Students trusted her because she sounded like someone who understood the system and knew how to navigate it. Caleb listened carefully as one former advisor recalled how Moore would flag certain students for external opportunities, suggesting programs that might help them bridge financial shortfalls. It had seemed proactive at the time, even generous. No one questioned why those same students stopped showing up shortly afterward. When Caleb finally sat across from Moore in her office, the space itself told a story. The furniture was immaculate, the walls lined with framed degrees and inspirational quotes about perseverance and opportunity. She greeted him with practiced warmth, offered coffee, asked how she could help. Her voice carried the calm assurance of someone accustomed to authority without ever needing to assert it. Caleb introduced himself and watched her carefully as he explained why he was there. The warmth did not disappear, but it shifted, tightening at the edges. He asked her about Northvale Biomedical. At first, she answered easily, dismissively. Companies came to campus all the time. Research opportunities were common. Students needed money. The phrasing was familiar, almost rehearsed. When he pressed further, mentioning specific years, specific students, the pauses grew longer. She maintained eye contact, but her hands betrayed her, fingers tightening around her pen, knuckles whitening just enough to notice. Caleb had seen this before. It was the moment when someone realized the ground beneath them was not as solid as they believed. Moore insisted she had never forced anyone to do anything. She framed her role as informational advisory. Students made their own choices. She had merely connected them with resources. Caleb didn't argue. He didn't accuse. He let silence do the work. In that silence, the shape of her involvement began to emerge. She knew which students were desperate. She knew which ones lacked strong family support, which ones might hesitate to involve parents or question authority. She knew who could disappear without triggering immediate alarms. That knowledge was power, and she had wielded it quietly for years. What disturbed Caleb most was how convincingly Moore justified herself. She spoke about limited funding, about the impossible choices students faced, about how the system failed them daily. In her telling, she had been a pragmatist, offering solutions where none officially existed. The line between advocacy and exploitation blurred easily when framed that way. Caleb understood the danger of that logic. It allowed harm to masquerade as help. It allowed responsibility to dissolve into rationalization. As the investigation deepened, evidence began to close in around her. Emails recovered from old servers showed direct communication between Moore and Northvale representatives. far more frequent than she had admitted. There were lists attached, anonymized but detailed, outlining student profiles that matched the victims almost exactly. Financial stress, limited housing stability, no immediate dependents who might raise alarms. Seeing those attributes reduced to bullet points made Caleb's stomach turn. These were not recommendations. They were selections. When confronted with this evidence, Moore's composure finally cracked. The calm veneer fractured, replaced by defensiveness, then fear. She asked about immunity, about legal counsel, about what would happen next. Caleb noted how quickly her concern shifted from students to herself. It was a subtle transition, but telling. The person who had once framed herself as a protector now spoke like someone calculating exposure and damage control. In private moments, Caleb wrestled with his anger. Moore was not the one who had built the basement or administered the drugs. She had not stood over hospital beds recording data as bodies failed. But without her, the operation would have starved. She was the intake valve, the one who fed vulnerable lives into a system designed to consume them. Her power lay not in violence, but in access. And access, Caleb realized, was often more dangerous. As more witnesses came forward, a pattern of quiet coercion emerged. Students described being told that opportunities like this were rare, that turning them down would be irresponsible. Some recalled Moore discouraging them from discussing the programs with family, framing it as a matter of confidentiality. Others remembered being reassured that everything had been vetted by the university, that there was no risk. Those reassurances had not been accidental. They had been tailored. The realization settled heavily on Caleb. The crime did not begin in a basement or a lab. It began in offices like Moore's, in conversations framed as guidance, in trust carefully cultivated and then redirected. The educational system itself had been weaponized, its language and authority used to legitimize exploitation. Moore had understood that better than anyone. By the time formal charges were discussed, Moore's role was undeniable. She had not been a passive participant or an unwitting accomplice. She had been an enabler, a recruiter, a gatekeeper who decided whose lives could be risked without consequence. Sitting alone in his office late one night, Caleb stared at the evidence laid out before him and felt the weight of it settle into something cold and resolute. This was not just about stopping one scientist or exposing one company. It was about dismantling the pathways that allowed predation to disguise itself as opportunity. And Evelyn Moore had been one of the most critical pathways of all. The truth about what had been done to the victims emerged slowly, not as a single revelation but as a series of confirmations that stripped away any remaining ambiguity. When the forensic toxicology reports arrived, they did not read like the aftermath of negligence or a trial gone wrong. They read like documentation. Each victim's system showed traces of compounds did not exist in any approved database. Chemicals engineered to interact with the nervous system in unpredictable ways. Some mimicked known antidepressants, others targeted stress hormones, but none followed established safety thresholds. The dosages had not been consistent, either. They varied deliberately, adjusted over time, as though someone had been observing responses and refining the process. Caleb Rivers sat with the medical examiner as she walked him through the findings, her voice steady but tight. The bodies told stories the victims never got to finish. Tissue damage showed prolonged exposure, not a single catastrophic dose. Organs had failed in sequence, not all at once, suggesting escalation rather than accident. In several cases, evidence indicated that dosages had been reduced after severe reactions, not to protect the patient, but to prolong survival. That detail settled heavily in Caleb's chest. It meant suffering had been managed, not prevented. Pain had been extended to serve a purpose. The handwritten logs recovered from the abandoned facility confirmed what the bodies implied. They were meticulous, clinical, devoid of anything resembling empathy. Victims were not referred to by name, only by identifiers. Subject A. Subject B. Responses were charted, symptoms noted with detached precision. No tremors, cardiac irregularities, cognitive decline. The language never shifted, even as conditions worsened. There was no acknowledgement of fear, no recognition of personhood. To whoever had written those notes, the human element was irrelevant noise in a system designed to extract data. What disturbed Caleb most was the logic underlying it all. This was not experimentation driven by desperation or ignorance. It was hypothesis-driven research. Each subject appeared to have been selected for specific traits: age, baseline health, stress levels, variables that could influence how a body reacted under prolonged chemical strain. The drugs themselves seemed designed not to cure, but to push boundaries, to identify the precise point at which systems failed. It was research obsessed not with healing, but with limits. How much could a body take before it broke? How long could it be held at the edge? The survivor's case illuminated the darkest intention of all. Her records showed that after initial reactions nearly killed her, the compound had been reduced, not discontinued. Her condition stabilized into a fragile equilibrium, sustained by minimal nutrition and constant monitoring. Notes in the margin suggested fascination with her resilience, prolonged viability under stress conditions, adaptive response exceeding projections. Caleb read those words again and again, anger tightening his jaw. She had not been spared. She had been preserved. As Caleb pieced together the timeline, it became clear that the experiment had evolved. Early subjects had died quickly, their bodies unable to tolerate the compounds. Later ones lasted longer, not because the drugs were safer, but because the method had been refined. Dosages adjusted, intervals extended, variables controlled more carefully. Failure had not stopped the research, it had improved it. Each death had informed the next phase. That realization made the entire operation feel like a staircase built on corpses, each step laid with cold intention. The ethical violations were staggering, but what haunted Caleb was how unnecessary it all was. The knowledge being sought did not justify the cost, not scientifically, not morally. The questions being asked were not ones that demanded answers at any price. They were curiosities twisted into obsession, pursued because someone had decided that consent could be manufactured and suffering quantified. There was no grand humanitarian goal hidden beneath the cruelty, only the desire to know regardless of consequence. When Caleb discussed the findings with colleagues, the language in the room shifted. This was no longer framed as illegal research or reckless experimentation. It was torture, carried out under the guise of science. The victims had been imprisoned not because they posed a threat, but because their bodies were useful. Their fear, pain, and eventual deaths were treated as data points, stripped of context and meaning. The more Caleb absorbed, the more he understood that the cruelty was not incidental. It was structural. He thought about the rooms beneath the building, how clean and orderly they had been despite the horror they contained. That order now made sense. Chaos would have interfered with observation. Struggle would have disrupted measurements. Even resistance, when it occurred, had been noted as a variable rather than a violation. The experiment required control, and control had been enforced through isolation, starvation, and chemical dependency. The victims had not been allowed to die quickly because quick death yielded limited information. Prolonged decline was the goal. What unsettled Caleb most was how easily this mindset could disguise itself as intellectual rigor. The notes were calm. The data was organized. To an untrained eye, it might even look impressive. That was the danger. Stripped of humanity, the language of science could normalize almost anything. The line between research and abuse vanished the moment the subjects were no longer seen as people. In those logs, Caleb saw that moment happen over and over again. Late one night, alone in his office, Caleb reread the survivor's final words in the context of what he now knew. She hadn't said she had been experimented on. She hadn't needed to. The truth was embedded in her body, in the way it had been kept alive against all odds. Her survival was not evidence of mercy. It was proof of intent. She had lived because she was valuable alive, because her suffering still produced information. The weight of that realization changed how Caleb viewed the entire case. This was not about a scientist who had lost his way. It was about someone who had chosen to redefine morality around his work, someone who had decided that progress justified anything done in its name. The victims had been reduced to instruments, their deaths treated as acceptable losses in pursuit of knowledge no one had the right to claim. As Caleb closed the file, one thought refused to leave him. If this was what had been found, if this was what had been documented, then what else existed beyond the scope of discovery? How many other rooms, other subjects, other iterations of the same experiment were still hidden behind locked doors? The research had not ended in that basement. It had only revealed itself. And now that Caleb understood its true nature, he knew there could be no half measures. This was not a case to be managed. It was a system to be dismantled, completely, before another human life was reduced to an entry in a notebook labeled subject. The confirmation that there was another location did not arrive with drama or certainty. It crept in through inconsistencies, through details that refused to align, no matter how many times Caleb Rivers reorganized them. The timeline from the Ashland Avenue basement suggested an ending, yet the survivor's warning insisted otherwise. When Caleb overlaid her captivity with the company's bankruptcy records, a troubling gap emerged. Northvale Biomedical had ceased operations on paper, but the flow of resources, maintenance, and human involvement clearly had not stopped. Someone had continued to fund, supply, and oversee what had begun there. The basement beneath the abandoned plant had been closed carefully, not in panic, but with intention. That alone suggested continuity elsewhere. The breakthrough came from what was missing. In the recovered logs, Caleb noticed abrupt shifts in documentation style, changes in terminology that hinted at a different environment. References to temperature control systems that did not exist at the Ashland site. Mentions of reinforced sound barriers, upgraded power sources, and modified layouts designed to improve containment. These notes did not describe renovations. They described relocation. The experiment had outgrown its first shell, and whoever ran it had moved on to a space better suited to long-term secrecy. Financial records confirmed it. A shell company, created quietly years after Northvale's collapse, had been paying utilities on an industrial property across the river, just far enough from the city center to avoid attention. The transactions were unremarkable on their own small maintenance fees, periodic equipment purchases, but together they formed a heartbeat. Something was still operating. Caleb felt the weight of that realization settle into his bones. The victims they had found were not the full count. They were the remains of an early phase. When the warrant finally came through, the operation moved quickly. The location sat in an industrial zone where warehouses pressed against one another like blank faces, each indistinguishable from the next. The building itself was forgettable by design, a low structure with no signage, its windows blacked out from the inside. To a passerby it looked empty, abandoned, another casualty of economic decline. But Caleb knew better now. He had learned what empty really meant. This place was not empty, it was quiet. The entry team breached just before dawn, the kind of hour when the world was half asleep and secrets were easiest to keep. Inside, the main floor confirmed their suspicions. It had been stripped down to bare concrete, cleared of anything that might suggest activity. No desks, no offices, no paperwork, just space. But Caleb had learned not to trust surfaces. When they found the stairwell, hidden behind a false wall reinforced with metal framing, his pulse quickened. The descent felt familiar, the air cooling with each step, the sound dampening until even their breathing seemed too loud. The basement layout mirrored the first sight but refined it. The corridor was wider, the doors heavier, the rooms more numerous. 10 this time, arranged symmetrically on both sides. Each door bore signs of repeated use, scratches around the handles, worn hinges, faint smudges where hands had pressed again and again. When the first door opened, the difference was immediate. The bed inside was not neatly arranged. The restraints were visible, bolted directly into the frame. The remains showed signs of struggle, muscles frozen in postures that spoke of resistance rather than resignation. This place had not been as controlled. Or perhaps the subjects had understood sooner what was happening to them. Room by room, the story unfolded. Some victims appeared to have died quickly, others after prolonged confinement. The damage varied, but the pattern did not. Chemical exposure, malnutrition, isolation. In several rooms, the walls bore marks where something hard had struck them repeatedly. Fingernail scratches, blood traces long since dried. Evidence of panic, of bodies that had not gone quietly. Caleb felt a wave of nausea rise as he moved through the space. The first basement had been clinical, detached. This one was raw. It told the story of people who had realized too late that there would be no release. The ninth room broke whatever composure Caleb had left. The body inside lay twisted, one arm stretched toward the door, fingers curled as if grasping for something just out of reach. The EV line had been ripped free, leaving dark stains on the mattress. The equipment showed signs of forced removal, alarms likely silenced manually. This person had tried to escape, had understood the rules and broken them anyway. Caleb stood there longer than he should have, imagining the moment when hope had flared, brief and dangerous, before being extinguished. The final room was empty. That absence hit harder than any of the bodies. The bed was made, sheets clean, IV bag full. The monitors were on, waiting. Someone had been there recently, very recently. The operation had not just existed. It had been active until the moment the net closed. Whoever ran it had known to leave, had been tipped off, or had anticipated discovery. Caleb felt a surge of fury at that thought, but beneath it was something colder. Fear. If the operator had escaped once, there was no guarantee this was the last place. Forensics worked through the night, cataloging what they found. The identities of the victims emerged over the following days, each one adding weight to the case. Students again, young, vulnerable, taken over a span of years that stretched well beyond the Ashland operation. The survivor's warning had been accurate down to its final implication. There had been others. And there might have been more still, beyond even this second sight. As Caleb reviewed the findings, one conclusion became unavoidable. The first basement had been an experiment in feasibility. The second had been an expansion designed to increase capacity and control. This was not escalation born of recklessness. It was growth. Someone had learned from early mistakes and built something more efficient, more secure. The horror lay not just in the deaths, but in the improvement. Standing outside the warehouse as dawn broke, Caleb watched the building recede into the ordinary backdrop of the city. From the outside, it looked like nothing. That was the most terrifying part. The operation had not relied on isolation or remoteness. It had thrived in plain sight, hidden by the assumption that nothing important could be happening there. The discovery of the second facility did not bring relief. It stripped away any remaining illusion that the case was nearing its end. Caleb understood then that they were not chasing a single crime scene. They were uncovering a system that had been refined over time, one location feeding into the next. Each discovery raised a new question. How many others existed? How many had been dismantled without leaving a trace? And how many people were still missing, their absence explained away while the truth remained locked behind concrete and steel? The second facility did not close the chapter the way he had hoped. It confirmed what he had feared from the beginning. This was not a story with a simple ending. It was a structure, and dismantling it would require following every corridor to its source, no matter how far it led. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It began as a subtle shift, a feeling Caleb Rivers recognized from years on the force, the sense that the air around a case had changed. After the discovery of the second facility, doors that had once opened easily now closed with polite resistance. Calls went unanswered longer than they should have. Meetings were postponed without explanation. It wasn't obstruction in any formal sense, just friction introduced at every turn, as if someone were gently pressing a hand against his chest, testing how hard he was willing to push back. The first overt sign came one evening when Caleb returned home to find his front door unlocked. He was meticulous about routineness. The lock was always the last thing he checked before leaving. He stood still in the hallway for a full minute, listening, every sense tuned for movement. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. He cleared each room methodically, weapon drawn, heart steady but heavy. Nothing was missing. Nothing appeared disturbed, and yet something was wrong. His desk drawers sat closed when he always left one slightly open. Papers had been shifted, not taken, just rearranged enough to signal intent. Someone had been there. Someone had wanted him to know. That night, he found the first listening device. It was small, almost elegant in its simplicity, tucked beneath the edge of his desk, where it would never catch the eye unless you knew to look. Once he saw it, he found two more, placed with professional care. The message was unmistakable. He was being watched. Not sporadically. Constantly. The realizations sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with calculation. This was not intimidation meant to scare him off immediately. It was surveillance designed to measure his response. The phone call came the next day. The voice on the other end was distorted, stripped of any identifying features. It didn't shout or threaten directly. It spoke calmly, almost conversationally, as if offering advice. The message was brief. He had found enough. The bodies were justice enough. Continuing would complicate things for people who didn't need complications. When Caleb asked who he was speaking to, the line went dead. He sat there long after, phone pressed to his ear, feeling the full implication settle in. This was bigger than a rogue scientist and a complicit administrator. Someone else had a stake in keeping this buried. The intimidation escalated quietly. A photograph appeared in his mailbox one morning, slipped inside without a stamp. It showed his sister stepping out of her apartment, taken from across the street. Another showed his nephew at school, laughing, unaware of the lens trained on him. There was no note this time. None was needed. The message had shifted from observation to leverage. Caleb felt something harden in his chest as he stared at the images. This was the line. Whatever game was being played, it had crossed into his family's lives. He moved quickly after that, relocating his sister and nephew without explanation beyond vague assurances. He didn't tell them everything. He couldn't. Not yet. He checked their space for devices the same way. He had checked his own and found there too, hidden in corners no one ever looked at. Whoever was watching him had already expanded the perimeter. The realization was sobering. This was not a lone protector acting on impulse. It was a network, or at least someone with resources and patience. At the precinct, Caleb kept his reactions measured. He documented everything, reported the surveillance through proper channels, knowing full well that doing so might alert the very people watching him. But silence was not an option. He needed a record. If anything happened to him, the trail had to exist. Still, he felt the walls closing in, not physically, but institutionally. There were questions now about jurisdiction, about whether the case should be transferred, about whether certain avenues of investigation were worth the risk. Each question carried the same subtext: stop. The psychological toll was heavier than the physical threat. Caleb began to second-guess small decisions, wondering which conversations were being listened to, which moments were being recorded. He stopped speaking freely in his own home, choosing words carefully even when alone. Sleep came in short bursts, fractured by dreams of corridors and unseen eyes. And yet, beneath the strain, something else took root. Defiance. Whoever was applying this pressure had misjudged him. They had assumed fear would override obligation. They had assumed wrong. What injured Caleb most was the implication that the victims were expendable, that their suffering could be balanced against inconvenience and risk. The threats were framed as practical considerations, as though justice were a luxury rather than a duty. He thought of the survivor's final effort, the way she had forced out those last warnings despite the cost. She had endured 18 years of captivity and still found the strength to speak. Compared to that, intimidation felt small, manageable. He began taking precautions quietly, working offline when possible, sharing information redundantly so no single point of failure could erase progress. He trusted fewer people, but he trusted them deeply. The case moved slower, but it moved forward. Each attempt to slow him down only confirmed what he already suspected. The truth they were closing in on threatened more than one reputation chain, more than one institution. That meant it mattered. Late one night, after another anonymous warning left on his voicemail, Caleb stood in the darkened precinct parking lot and looked up at the building. lights glowing behind windows where other detectives worked other cases. He realized then that intimidation was a confession of sorts. If there were nothing left to hide, no one would bother watching him. The pressure was proof that he was close. The threats didn't stop. They became part of the background noise of the investigation, a constant reminder that every step forward carried risk. But they also clarified something fundamental. This was no longer just about uncovering what had happened. It was about resisting the impulse to look away when the cost of looking became personal. Whoever was trying to silence him had underestimated the weight of that choice. Caleb knew the danger was real. He also knew backing down would not make it disappear. It would only shift the target to someone else, someone less prepared, less stubborn. As he gathered his files and locked his office for the night, he felt the familiar mix of exhaustion and resolve settle over him. The intimidation had failed in its primary objective. Instead of stopping him, it had sharpened his focus. Whoever was behind it had revealed themselves not as untouchable, but as afraid. And fear, Caleb had learned, was often the most reliable sign that the truth was getting close. Finding Adrian Kovacs did not happen through a dramatic tip or a sudden confession. It happened through money, because money always left marks no matter how carefully it was moved. Caleb Rivers worked with financial analysts who specialized in tracing transactions that were meant to disappear, following thin threads through shell companies, offshore accounts, and deliberately vague invoices. What emerged was not a single trail, but a web one designed to obscure ownership while maintaining access. The pattern suggested someone who understood how institutions looked for fraud, and how to stay just outside their line of sight. This was not the behavior of a man on the run. It was the behavior of someone hiding in plain sight. The breakthrough came from a property deed, buried beneath 3 layers of corporate ownership. Each one registered to a different entity, with no obvious connection to the next. On paper, the house belonged to a holding company based overseas, managed by a trust that existed only as a legal placeholder. But when Caleb traced the maintenance payments, the utility usage, and the insurance records, a human footprint began to form. Someone lived there year-round. Someone paid cash equivalents to avoid credit exposure. Someone had built a life designed to leave no ripples. The address led to a quiet suburb outside Springfield, Illinois, a place known more for manicured lawns and commuter routines than hidden atrocities. Caleb drove past the house for the first time on a gray afternoon, blending easily into the rhythm of the neighborhood. The property was large but unremarkable, set back from the road behind a low fence and mature trees. It was the kind of place designed to project stability rather than wealth, success without spectacle. The mailbox bore a name that meant nothing to him, a carefully chosen alias with no digital history beyond the essentials. Everything about the residence suggested intention. Kovacs had not chosen this place to hide. He had chosen it to disappear into normalcy. Surveillance confirmed what paperwork had hinted at. The man living there kept a strict routine. Morning walks, regular grocery trips, occasional visits from service professionals paid promptly and dismissed quickly. No friends, no family, no visible social circle. He lived like someone who did not want to be known, only tolerated. Caleb watched from a distance as Kovacs stepped out onto the porch one morning, older than his photographs but unmistakable. The posture was the same. The stillness. The way he surveyed his surroundings without appearing to look at anything in particular. This was not a man haunted by guilt. It was a man confident in his ability to remain untouched. What unsettled Caleb most was how close Kovacs had been all along. He had not fled the country or retreated to some unreachable refuge. He had stayed within driving distance of the city, where his crimes began, living a quiet life under a new name while the consequences unfolded elsewhere. That choice spoke volumes. It suggested arrogance, yes, but also a belief that the system itself would protect him as long as he complied with its surface rules. He paid taxes. He followed zoning laws. He existed just enough to be legitimate. Everything else had been shed. As the case tightened around him, Caleb learned more about how Kovacs had structured his escape. that the bankruptcy of Northvale Biomedical had not been an ending but a transfer. Assets had been liquidated in ways that appeared standard. Yet a portion of the funds had been rerouted through international channels before the final accounting. That money had sustained him quietly for years, financing relocations, equipment purchases, and whatever operations had followed the second facility. The man had planned not just to survive exposure, but to outlast it. Preparing the arrest required precision. Caleb understood that this was not a suspect who would panic or run. Kovacs would comply outwardly, trusting process to delay consequences as long as possible. The warrant was sealed until the last possible moment. The team assembled before dawn, parking down the street to avoid attention. Neighbors slept, unaware that a man they passed daily carried the weight of dozens of stolen lives behind his calm expression. When they approached the house, there was no alarm, no resistance. Kovacs answered the door himself, already dressed, as though he had been expecting them. His face showed no surprise, only mild curiosity, the same expression one might wear when interrupted during a thought. Caleb introduced himself and read the warrant slowly, watching for any flicker of recognition. There was none. Kovacs listened attentively, hands folded, posture relaxed. When the cuffs were placed on his wrists, he did not protest. He did not ask why. He asked only one question: how many did you find? The question landed like a physical blow. It confirmed everything Caleb needed to know. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not denial. Kovacs had measured success by what remained hidden, not by what had been lost. As they led him to the car, he glanced once at the house, not with regret, but with calculation. As though assessing whether it had served its purpose. Caleb realized then that Kovacs had never thought of himself as a fugitive. He had thought of himself as unfinished. At the precinct, Kovacs spoke freely, but only in abstractions. He referred to the victims as participants, the experiments as necessary steps toward understanding human thresholds. He framed his work as progress misunderstood by small minds, hindered by fear and outdated ethics. Caleb listened without interruption, letting the man reveal himself fully. There was no remorse in his voice, no acknowledgement of harm beyond inconvenience. To Kovacs, the suffering of others was incidental, a cost absorbed in pursuit of knowledge he believed belonged to him alone. What struck Caleb most was how ordinary the man seemed. No grand speeches, no rage, just quiet certainty. It was the kind of certainty that allowed someone to sleep at night knowing exactly what they had done. Kovacs had not hidden because he felt guilt. He had hidden because he believed time would dull the edges of memory, that eventually no one would care enough to keep looking. He had been wrong. As the doors closed behind him and the processing began, Caleb felt no satisfaction, only a heavy sense of responsibility fulfilled. Finding Kovacs did not undo what had been done. It did not restore the lives lost or erase the years of suffering endured in silence. But it did something essential. It ended the illusion that a man could dismantle himself into paperwork and aliases and live untouched by the consequences of his choices. Later, standing outside the station as the sun rose, Caleb thought about how easily Kovacs had blended into the background of ordinary life. The danger had never been that he was hiding in darkness. The danger was that he had learned how to hide in light. The arrest itself was quiet, almost anticlimactic, and that was what unsettled Caleb Rivers the most. There was no struggle, no raised voice, no desperate attempt to bargain or flee. Adrian Kovacs walked into custody with the same composure he had carried through decades of deception. Hands relaxed as the cuffs closed around his wrists, posture upright, expression unreadable. To anyone watching from the outside, it could have looked like a misunderstanding being resolved, a bureaucratic inconvenience, rather than the collapse of a hidden empire built on suffering. Caleb understood then that Kovacs had never imagined an ending that involved accountability. He had only planned for continuation. In the interrogation room, the air felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves recognized the weight of what was about to be said. Kovacs sat across from Caleb with an almost scholarly interest, eyes alert, assessing. He did not ask for a lawyer immediately. He did not deny his identity or the evidence. Instead, he listened as the charges were read: 14 counts of murder, multiple counts of kidnapping, unlawful human experimentation, false imprisonment. Each word landed without visible impact. When Caleb finally asked him why, Kovacs tilted his head slightly, as though the question itself were flawed. He spoke calmly, precisely, choosing his words with care. He did not describe the victims as people, only as participants, subjects, contributors to knowledge. He spoke about the limits of current medicine, about how progress had always demanded sacrifice, how every major advancement carried blood in its history. His tone was not defensive. It was explanatory, almost patient, as if he were correcting a misunderstanding. In his mind, he had not committed atrocities. He had filled a gap left by timidity and regulation. Caleb listened without interruption, letting the man expose the core of his thinking. There was no remorse to uncover because none existed. Kovacs believed deeply, almost religiously, in the righteousness of his work. Ethics, he suggested, were constructs designed to comfort those unwilling to confront uncomfortable truths. Humanity advanced because a few were willing to do what others would not. When Caleb mentioned the survivor, the woman who had endured 18 years underground only to die hours after being rescued, Kovacs's eyes flickered with interest rather than regret. He called her an anomaly, valuable data, proof of concept. That was when Caleb felt the last illusion fall away. There was no argument that could reach this man. No appeal to empathy or shared morality. Kovacs had built an internal logic that justified everything, a framework in which suffering was incidental and consent was a technicality. To him, the victim's pain did not invalidate the work. It validated it. The realization chilled Caleb more than any threat or intimidation ever had. This was not a man who could be reasoned with. This was a man who had to be stopped permanently. The trial that followed became a public reckoning. Families filled the courtroom day after day, sitting within feet of the man who had taken so much from them. Some stared at him openly. Others could not bring themselves to look in his direction. Prosecutors laid out the evidence methodically, dismantling the narrative of voluntary participation piece by piece. Consent forms were shown to be meaningless under coercion. The locked rooms, the restraints, the logs detailing escalating suffering destroyed any pretense of legitimacy. Expert witnesses testified that no ethical framework could justify what had been done, that this was not research but torture masquerading as science. Kovacs listened to it all with the same detached curiosity he had shown in interrogation. He took notes during testimony, occasionally whispering to his attorney, not in fear but in critique. When allowed to speak, he did not apologize. He defended his philosophy, framing himself as a pioneer persecuted for seeing too far ahead of his time. The jury watched him closely, and Caleb could see the shift as they realized what kind of man sat before them. Not a monster in the theatrical sense, but something colder and more dangerous. A person who could explain away anything. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts. Life sentences stacked one atop another, ensuring that even time itself could not offer escape. The judge spoke of accountability, of the sanctity of human life, of the line that could never be crossed, regardless of ambition. Kovacs stood silently as the sentence was read, his expression unchanged. When the bailiff led him away, he did not look back at the families. He did not look at Caleb. He walked forward as if already elsewhere, already removed from the consequences unfolding behind him. In the weeks that followed, the weight of the case settled in unexpected ways. Media attention surged, then waned. Reforms were promised. Oversight tightened. New policies were drafted to prevent similar abuses. None of it felt like enough. Caleb attended the funerals quietly, standing at the back, watching families say goodbye to remains returned far too late. He listened as parents spoke of who their children had been, of the lives they might have lived. Those stories mattered more to him than any legal victory. They restored humanity to names that had been reduced to numbers in a notebook. Kovacs died in prison 2 years later from natural causes. The news arrived without ceremony, a brief notification in a crowded inbox. There was no sense of closure in it, only a dull acknowledgement that even life sentences were finite in their own way. He had not suffered. He had not reckoned with what he had done. He had simply stopped existing. Caleb felt no satisfaction in that ending. Justice, he had learned, was rarely symmetrical. What remained was the work, the responsibility to remember, the obligation to keep looking when the system grew tired, when attention drifted elsewhere. Caleb visited the memorial erected near the abandoned building where it had all begun, reading the names etched into metal, each one a life interrupted. He understood now that stopping Kovacs had not ended the conditions that allowed him to exist. It had only proven that vigilance mattered, that persistence could force even the most carefully hidden truths into the light. The arrest had not been a triumph. It had been a boundary, a declaration that no amount of intelligence or discipline could place someone beyond consequence. As Caleb turned away from the memorial and back toward the city, he carried that lesson with him. The case had taken years from his life, altered him in ways he would never fully articulate. But it had also clarified something essential. Evil did not always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes it wore the mask of progress, spoke the language of reason, and waited patiently for the world to look away. And when it did, it was the duty of anyone to refuse. The work did not end with the verdict, and Caleb Rivers understood that almost immediately. When the courtroom emptied, and the cameras moved on, what remained were families still waking up to absence, still measuring time by the moment everything had gone wrong. Justice, as the system defined it, had been delivered, but justice did not tuck children back into beds or return phone calls that had gone unanswered for decades. It did not give back birthdays missed, careers never begun, lives that existed now only in memory and photographs. Caleb felt the weight of that truth settle over him in the quiet weeks that followed. Heavier than the case files he finally boxed up and labeled closed. He attended every burial, standing just behind the families, close enough to hear the words spoken but far enough to remain unseen. Some funerals were crowded, communities gathering to mourn what had been taken. Others were painfully small, the years having thinned connections until only a few remained. In each, Caleb watched parents lower their heads, siblings hold one another. Friends struggle to reconcile who the victims had been with what they had endured. The remains returned to them were fragments of lives interrupted, but they were also proof. Proof that the disappearances had not been imagined, that the waiting had not been in vain. In time, a memorial was erected near the first building, simple and unadorned. 14 names etched into metal, each accompanied by dates that told the story without explanation. Visitors began to leave flowers, handwritten notes, tokens of grief and remembrance. Caleb visited often, sometimes alone, sometimes with families who had come to sit and talk to the names, as if the people behind them might still be listening. He learned that grief did not fade so much as change shape. It softened around the edges, but it never disappeared. The city passed new regulations in response to the case. Oversight tightened. Universities were required to monitor research recruitment more closely, to flag unusual patterns, to intervene when students vanished without explanation. Committees were formed. Policies were written. Caleb knew these changes mattered, even if they arrived too late for the 14 whose lives had been lost. Prevention was a quiet form of justice, one that rarely made headlines but saved lives nonetheless. He took some comfort in that, though it did not erase the bitterness of knowing what had been allowed to happen. On the 10th anniversary of the discovery, Caleb returned to the abandoned industrial corridor, where it had all begun. The building was still there, its windows boarded, its walls layered with new graffiti over old. Time had not redeemed it. It had merely covered it. Standing across the street, Caleb watched people pass without looking twice, unaware of what had once been hidden beneath their feet. He did not resent them for it. Most people lived their lives assuming that horrors existed somewhere else, far away, contained. He had learned that assumption was a luxury. The call came as he stood there, phone buzzing softly in his hand. Another tip. Another abandoned property. Another possibility. The details were vague, the tone familiar. He closed his eyes briefly before answering, letting the weight of the past settle where it belongs. The work was never done. It simply changed form, moving from one case to the next, one family to another. The fight was not against evil in the abstract, but against indifference, against the urge to look away when answers became uncomfortable. Caleb had aged over the years, lines etched deeper around his eyes, his posture a little more careful than it once had been, but his resolve remained intact. He had learned that persistence mattered more than brilliance, that justice was often the result of someone refusing to stop asking questions long after others had grown tired. He carried the faces of the 14 with him now, not as a burden, but as a reminder. They were the reason he stayed when he could have left. The reason he kept pushing when the system suggested it was time to move on. Families began to reach out to him beyond the case, asking for advice, for guidance. For someone who understood how the machinery worked when a loved one went missing. He listened, connected them with resources, showed them how to demand attention when doors closed too quickly. In doing so, he honored the promise he had made silently years earlier, that no one would disappear without someone caring enough to keep looking. Some nights, when the city was quiet and sleep came reluctantly, Caleb thought about the man he had stopped and the system that had enabled him. He knew there would be others like him, different faces, different methods, but driven by the same belief that certain lives could be used without consequence. That knowledge did not paralyze him. It clarified his purpose. Vigilance was not a one-time act. It was a discipline, practiced daily, reinforced by memory. On a cold morning each year, Caleb returned to the memorial and stood among the names. He spoke to them quietly, not in apology but in acknowledgement. He told them the work continued, that their stories had changed things, even if the change was imperfect, that they had not been forgotten. The wind moved through the metal plaques, carrying the sound like a low hum, and for a moment, the space felt full rather than empty. When he finally turned away and walked back to his car, Caleb did so without ceremony. There was another address waiting, another family hoping for answers, another silence to be broken. The case that had defined him did not end with a sentence or a death in custody. It lived on in the choices he made every day thereafter, to keep looking, to keep listening, to keep believing that even in a system that failed too often, persistence could still carve out moments of truth. And as long as there were people who vanished without explanation, that belief would be reason enough to continue. The central lesson of this story is not simply that evil exists, but that it often survives not because it is powerful, but because it is tolerated, overlooked, or misunderstood. The greatest harm in the narrative does not come from a single individual's cruelty alone, but from a chain of quiet failures, institutions that trusted appearances over accountability, systems that equated vulnerability with disposability, and assumptions that certain disappearances were not worth sustained attention. The story reminds us that injustice rarely announces itself loudly. More often, it embeds itself in procedures, paperwork, and polite indifference. When suffering is framed as unfortunate but explainable, when absence is rationalized rather than questioned, harm gains the time it needs to grow. Another profound lesson lies in how trust can be weaponized. The victims did not walk into danger because they were reckless. They did so because they believed in structures meant to protect them: education, medicine, authority, expertise. The language of opportunity and progress was used to disguise exploitation, turning hope into a trap. This speaks to a broader truth about modern society. Systems built on trust must be monitored precisely, because trust makes people vulnerable. When credibility is assumed rather than earned repeatedly, it becomes a shield for abuse. The story challenges the reader to recognize that good intentions and professional language are not safeguards on their own. Ethical responsibility requires constant scrutiny, especially where power meets desperation. The narrative also exposes how inequality determines whose pain is taken seriously. The victims were not invisible by accident. They were rendered invisible by social patterns that normalize loss among certain communities. Their disappearances were explained away not because evidence supported those explanations, but because it was easier for institutions to believe that young, marginalized people had simply slipped through the cracks by choice. This reveals a harsh truth. When society decides some lives are more understandable to lose, predators notice. The story teaches that injustice is not only about what is done, but about who is allowed to vanish without consequence. Attention, or the lack of it, becomes a form of power. Equally important is the lesson about persistence. The investigation does not succeed because of a single moment of brilliance or heroism, but because someone refuses to stop asking questions when the system suggests it is time to move on. The detective's role is not portrayed as triumphant or glamorous. It is exhausting, isolating, and often thankless. Yet it is precisely that refusal to accept partial answers that brings the truth into the light. The story argues that justice is not an event but a process, one that demands endurance more than certainty. Progress comes not from believing the system works automatically, but from individuals pushing it to work when it does not want to. The antagonist's worldview offers another critical lesson. He does not see himself as evil, and that is what makes him dangerous. By framing his actions as necessary, rational, and forward thinking, he demonstrates how morality can be hollowed out by ideology. When outcomes are valued over humanity, when data is prioritized above dignity, cruelty becomes procedural rather than emotional. The story warns against any philosophy that treats people as means rather than ends, regardless of how intellectual or visionary it sounds. History shows that some of the worst harms are committed not by those who hate, but by those who believe they are justified. There is also a sobering lesson about closure. Even when the perpetrator is caught and punished, the harm does not resolve neatly. Loss remains. Trauma lingers. Accountability does not reverse time. The story resists the comforting illusion that justice restores balance. Instead, it suggests that justice is about acknowledgement, prevention, and memory. It is about ensuring that suffering is recognized rather than erased, and that future harm becomes harder to commit. This reframing is crucial. Justice is not about making pain disappear, but about refusing to let it be meaningless. Finally, the story teaches that responsibility does not end with one case, one verdict, or one victory. Evil adapts, systems forget, and complacency returns quickly. The work of protection and accountability must be continuous, renewed with each generation and each new structure of power. The detective's continued vigilance represents a broader moral obligation shared by society as a whole. The lesson is clear: the cost of looking away is always higher than the cost of paying attention. Remembering, questioning, and refusing silence are not heroic acts reserved for rare individuals. They are collective duties. And when those duties are neglected, the consequences do not arrive suddenly. They arrive quietly, patiently, and with devastating permanence. If you enjoy stories that make you think twice before turning off the lights, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. There are still many things left unsaid, and we'll continue exploring them together.